Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. Blonde curls cascading over the shoulders. A final swipe of gloss painted pouty lips the color of cotton candy. "You can do this," the stranger whispered. The voice came out higher, softer than usual. Practiced. For years, this moment had lived only in daydreams. But tonight, fantasy became reality. Tonight, Drew would step out of the shadows and into the light. As Tiffany. One last critical look in the mirror. Did the waist cincher create enough femme? Was there any trace of stubble peeking through the foundation? A deep breath. The press of long acrylic nails against sweaty palms. This is really happening. Tiffany grabbed her sparkly clutch and teetered toward the front door on 5-inch heels. Her hand froze on the doorknob. What if the neighbors saw? What if someone recognized her? What if... No, she'd come too far to back down now. With a trembling exhale, Tiffany stepped outside. The warm evening air caressed her bare legs. She wobbled slightly, unaccustomed to navigating the world perched atop such precarious footwear. But each click of her heels against the sidewalk filled her with a heady rush of excitement. She was doing it. She was really doing it. Tiffany kept her eyes lowered, heart pounding as she made her way down the quiet suburban street. Dark houses loomed on either side, windows like judging eyes. Any moment she expected to hear shocked gasps or mocking laughter, but the night remained still and silent. As she rounded the corner onto a busier road, a giddy lightness bubbled up inside her. She'd made it this far without incident. Maybe, just maybe, she could pull this off. Neon signs flickered to life in shop windows. Music drifted from bars and restaurants, and for the first time, Tiffany allowed herself to lift her gaze and take in her surroundings. To her amazement, the world looked much the same as always. No one pointed or stared. No angry mobs materialized to chase her down. She was just another young woman out for the evening, unremarkable and unnoticed. The realization was simultaneously thrilling and anticlimactic. As her confidence grew, Tiffany's steps became surer, her posture straighter. She even dared to meet the eyes of passers-by, flashing coy smiles. A group of guys outside a bar whistled appreciatively as she passed, her cheeks flushed with mingled embarrassment and pride. She was almost to the theater when the police cruiser pulled up alongside her. Tiffany's stomach dropped. This was it. She'd been found out. They were going to arrest her or worse. "Hey there, miss. Everything all right?" Tiffany blinked in surprise. The officer was smiling at her, his tone friendly and concerned rather than accusatory. "Oh, yes. Everything's fine, officer." She cringed inwardly at how high and breathy her voice sounded. Surely he'd see right through her. But the policeman just nodded. "It's not really safe for a pretty young thing like you to be walking alone at this time of night. Where you headed? I'd be happy to give you a lift." Tiffany's mind raced. This was her chance to bolt, to get as far away as possible before he realized the truth. But some reckless impulse made her pause. "That's so kind of you. I'm actually on my way to the Majestic Theater, but I wouldn't want to be a bother." "No bother at all. Hop on in." Before she could second-guess herself, Tiffany was sliding into the passenger seat of the cruiser. The leather upholstery was cool against her bare thighs. She tugged self-consciously at her skirt, hyper-aware of how much skin she was showing. "So, what's playing at the Majestic tonight?" the officer asked as he pulled away from the curb. "Oh, Tiffany racked her brain, trying to remember what was currently showing. "The new Marvel movie, I think?" the officer chuckled. "Ah, a superhero fan, huh? Wouldn't have pegged you for the type." Tiffany's breath caught. Had she said something wrong? Given herself away? But the policeman just grinned and shook his head. "Then again, my daughter's obsessed with that stuff too. Says it's not just for boys anymore." "Your daughter sounds very wise," Tiffany managed, her racing heart beginning to slow. They chatted easily for the rest of the short drive. About movies, about the unseasonably warm weather, about the officer's family. With each passing moment, Tiffany felt herself relaxing further. This man truly saw her as nothing more than a young woman in need of assistance. All too soon, they were pulling up in front of the ornate facade of the Majestic. "Here we are, miss. You have a good night now, and be safe." "Thank you so much, officer. I really appreciate your kindness." Tiffany flashed him a warm smile as she climbed out of the car. She stood on the sidewalk, watching the cruiser disappear around the corner. A giddy laugh bubbled up from her chest. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. For one magical evening, the world had accepted her completely as Tiffany. The rush of validation was intoxicating. Still buzzing with excitement, she turned toward the theater entrance. But as she reached for the door, reality came crashing back. She had no ticket, no money to buy one. And even if she did, the thought of sitting in a dark theater surrounded by strangers suddenly seemed far too daunting. Tiffany's shoulders slumped. The empowering high of the past hour faded, leaving her feeling deflated and foolish. What had she been thinking coming out like this? She was just playing dress-up, pretending to be something she wasn't. With a heavy sigh, she turned away from the theater and began the long walk home. Each step in her too tight heels sent jolts of pain up her legs. The cool night air raised goosebumps on her exposed skin. By the time she reached her neighborhood, Tiffany's feet were blistered and bleeding. Mascara streaked her cheeks. She felt utterly ridiculous, a clumsy man in a bad costume rather than the confident woman she'd imagined herself to be. But as she fumbled with her keys, a flicker of movement caught her eye. Her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rossi, was taking out her garbage. The old woman squinted in Tiffany's direction. "Oh, hello there, dear. I don't believe we've met. Are you a friend of Drew's?" Tiffany froze, her mind going blank. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Mrs. Rossi tilted her head, frowning slightly. "Actually, you look an awful lot like... Oh my. Drew, is that you under all that?" Tiffany's eyes welled with tears. This was it. The moment she'd been dreading all night. She braced herself for disgust, for anger, for cruel laughter. But to her shock, Mrs. Rossi's weathered face softened into a gentle smile. "Well now, don't you look lovely? Those shoes are absolutely darling, though they can't be too comfortable after a night out, I'd imagine." A choked sob escaped Tiffany's throat. I can explain." Mrs. Rossi waved a dismissive hand. "No need to explain anything, dear. You just come on inside and let's get you a cup of tea. Those feet of yours must be killing you." Before Tiffany knew what was happening, she found herself being ushered into her neighbor's cozy living room. Mrs. Rossi busied herself in the kitchen while Tiffany perched awkwardly on the floral sofa, unsure what to do with her hands or where to look. "Here we are," Mrs. Rossi announced, returning with a steaming mug and a first aid kit. "Now, let's see about those blisters." As the old woman tenderly cleaned and bandaged Tiffany's abused feet, the whole story came pouring out. Years of secret longings and shame, the thrill and terror of finally stepping out as her true self, the kindness of the police officer, the crushing disappointment at the theater. Mrs. Rossi listened without judgment, offering sympathetic nods and the occasional tisk of disapproval at society's closed-mindedness. "You know," she said as she applied the final bandage, "this reminds me so much of my dear friend Evelyn. Well, back then we knew her as Edward." For the next hour, Mrs. Rossi regaled Tiffany with tales of her youth in 1960s San Francisco, of underground clubs and drag balls, of found families and hard-won freedoms, of a community that welcomed all with open arms. Things were different then, of course, she mused. So much fear and hatred, but also so much love and acceptance, if you knew where to look. Tiffany sat in awe, hanging on every word. She'd had no idea such a rich history existed, that there were others like her who had blazed trails and fought battles long before she was born. As the grandfather clock chimed midnight, Mrs. Rossi patted Tiffany's hand. "It's getting late, dear. You should head home and get some rest, but I want you to know my door is always open if you need anything. A listening ear, fashion advice, whatever you need." Tears welled in Tiffany's eyes once more, but this time they were tears of gratitude and relief. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea how much this means to me." Mrs. Rossi pulled her into a warm hug. "You be proud of who you are, sweetheart. The world's not always kind, but there are more people out there who will love and support you than you know." As Tiffany made her way next door, she felt as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone. Back in the safety of her bedroom, Tiffany carefully removed her makeup and wig. She hung up the satin dress and tucked away the lingerie and accessories. But as she caught sight of her reflection, smudged eyeliner, mussed hair, and all, she didn't feel the usual rush of shame and self-loathing. Instead, she saw possibility. The first glimpses of the woman she could become. Climbing into bed, Tiffany's mind swirled with plans, support groups to research, websites to explore. So much to learn about hormone therapy, voice training, legal name changes. But those were concerns for another day. Tonight, she allowed herself to bask in the glow of her small victory. She had taken the first trembling steps toward becoming her authentic self. And while the journey ahead would undoubtedly be long and difficult, she was no longer walking it alone. As sleep began to claim her, Tiffany's lips curved into a contented smile. For the first time in her life, she felt truly, completely herself, and it was beautiful. The next morning dawned bright and clear, birdsong filtering through the curtains. Tiffany stretched languidly, savoring the lingering scent of perfume on her skin. For a moment, the events of the previous night seemed like nothing more than a vivid dream. But then her gaze fell on the sparkly clutch tossed haphazardly on her dresser, the carefully folded pink dress hanging in her closet, the Band-Aids on her aching feet. It had been real, all of it. A giddy laugh bubbled up from her chest. She'd actually done it, stepped out into the world as her true self. And while it hadn't gone entirely according to plan, it had been freeing, exhilarating. Right. As she went about her morning routine, Tiffany's mind raced with possibilities. Maybe next time she'd actually see a movie, or go shopping, or dancing at a club. The world suddenly seemed full of exciting new experiences to explore. But first things first, she needed to thank Mrs. Rossi properly for her kindness and understanding. After showering and dressing in her usual jeans and t-shirt, Tiffany hesitated at her bedroom door. Part of her wanted to put on a full face of makeup, to greet the day as the woman she knew herself to be. But another part of her whispered that it was too soon, too risky. Baby steps. With a rueful smile, she compromised by swiping on a hint of tinted lip balm. It would have to do for now. The short walk next door felt different somehow. The morning sun seemed brighter, the air fresher. Tiffany found herself noticing little details she'd overlooked countless times before. The cheerful yellow of Mrs. Rossi's curtains, the whimsical gnome statues dotting her flower beds. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. What if last night had just been a fluke? What if Mrs. Rossi had changed her mind in the harsh light of day? Before she could talk herself out of it, the door swung open. Mrs. Rossi beamed up at her, still in a floral housecoat and fluffy slippers. "Drew, or do you prefer Tiffany? I was hoping you'd stop by. Come in, come in. I've just put on a pot of coffee." Tiffany blinked in surprise. "Oh, Tiffany is fine. When I'm dressed like this, though, Drew is okay too. I'm still figuring it all out, to be honest." Mrs. Rossi nodded sagely as she ushered Tiffany into the kitchen. "Of course, dear. These things take time. Now, how do you take your coffee?" As they settled at the small breakfast nook, steam rising from cheerful polka-dotted mugs, Tiffany found herself relaxing. There was no judgment in Mrs. Rossi's kind eyes, no hint of discomfort or forced politeness, just genuine warmth and interest. I wanted to thank you again for last night, Tiffany began. I was in such a state, and you were so incredibly kind. I don't know what I would have done if— Mrs. Rossi waved a dismissive hand. Nonsense, dear. That's what neighbors are for. Now tell me, have you given any thought to what comes next? Tiffany's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Well, last night was your first time out in the world as Tiffany, yes? But I doubt it will be your last. So what's the plan? Are you thinking of transitioning full-time? Or is this more of an occasional expression for you? Tiffany's mouth opened and closed, no words coming out. She hadn't allowed herself to think that far ahead. The idea of living as Tiffany all the time was both thrilling and terrifying. I'm not sure, she admitted finally. Part of me wants to dive in head first, to be Tiffany always, everywhere. But another part is scared. Of losing my job, my family, of not passing well enough, of the danger. Mrs. Rossi nodded sympathetically. All valid concerns, my dear. The world has come a long way, but it can still be a difficult place for trans folks. But let me tell you something. I've seen a lot of change in my years. And the one constant is that those who live authentically, who are true to themselves no matter the cost, are the ones who find real happiness. She reached across the table to pat Tiffany's hand. Whatever you decide, know that you have at least one person in your corner, and I'd be more than happy to introduce you to some of my friends in the community. Having a support system makes all the difference. Tears pricked at Tiffany's eyes. I'd like that. I'd like that very much. They spent the next hour talking. Mrs. Rossi shared more stories of her colorful past, painting vivid pictures of a world Tiffany had never known existed. In return, Tiffany opened up about her own journey, the first time she'd tried on her mother's clothes as a child, the years of repression and self-doubt, the gradual awakening to her true self. As the conversation wound down, Tiffany felt a sense of peace settle over her. For the first time, she could envision a future where she was truly, completely herself. It wouldn't be easy, but it was possible. Oh, I almost forgot, Mrs. Rossi exclaimed, rising from the table. I have something for you. She disappeared into another room, returning moments later with a small gift bag. I hope you don't mind. I dug through some old boxes this morning and found a few things I thought you might like. Tiffany accepted the bag with trembling hands. Inside, she found a delicate silver locket, a tube of vintage lipstick, and a well-worn paperback book titled Stone Butch Blues. The necklace was my mother's, Mrs. Rossi explained. The lipstick? Well, let's just say it has an interesting history involving a famous drag queen and a very important person politician. And the book, that saved my friend Evelyn's life. I hope it might speak to you, too. Tiffany clutched the gifts to her chest, overwhelmed by the gesture. I don't know what to say. Thank you for everything. Mrs. Rossi pulled her into a warm hug. You're embarking on a beautiful, difficult journey, my dear. But you're not alone. Remember that. As Tiffany made her way home, the weight of the gift bag felt like a promise, a link to a rich history, and a beacon of hope for the future. She may not have all the answers yet, but she had taken the first steps on the path to becoming her true self. And for now, that was enough. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.